Good evening, and welcome to our virtual school nurse forum, De-Escalating Strategies for Challenging Student Behavior. We're very grateful to have Dr. Brett Biller speaking with us tonight. A little bit about our speaker. As a licensed psychologist working with children and families who have been impacted by maltreatment, Dr. Brett Biller has had the privilege to work clinically with children, adolescents, and families from diverse socioeconomic and ethnic backgrounds who have experienced variety maltreatment, including physical and sexual abuse, neglect, and exposure to domestic violence. Dr. Biller has conducted forensic evaluations as well as provided ongoing individual and group therapy. He additionally consults with and provides educational lectures to school, child welfare agencies, law enforcement, and other medical and mental health professionals, as well as provide expert and fact testimony in criminal and civil hearings. Dr. Biller currently serves as the Mental Health Director, Section Chief at the Audrey Hepburn Children's House at Hackensack University Medical Center in Hackensack, New Jersey. And at this time, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Biller.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Allison. It is a pleasure to be here this evening with all of you and the opportunity to, to really talk about a multi-level concerns that really arise within schools that has multi-level solution to it, and that concept of a multi-level problem and a multi-level solution is going to become more clear as we get to speak. I encourage everybody, please ask questions, put them in the chat, and we will get to them. I was saying before we got started to Alice and Juliana that I really prefer the in-person, because then I get to interact and schmooze with everybody and answer questions. But I do appreciate being able to get to questions. So if you have them, don't be shy. Throw them in to that chat. I want to thank Allison first off for organizing this, putting this together, and ultimately Juliana as well. Juliana, I tell everyone, is my right and left hand and left and right foot typically. She is our coordinator for a no-hit zone program that is throughout the Hackensack Meridian Health Network, and we're moving into our relationship with partners throughout the state, and we'll explain a bit of what this no-hit zone and how it relates to de-escalating strategies for challenging school behaviors, social behaviors, emotional difficulties, and how it all ties in, and really gets at to what I was talking about before about a multi-layered solution to a multi-layered difficulties. Because when we talk about children acting out or having emotional behaviors, emotional problems, we're talking about concerns that come from models in the home, emotional difficulties regulating emotion. So there's different layers to that. And so we're going to see is to really come up with strategies to de-escalate or address these problems. It's a multi-layered solution as well. Disclosure: no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies to disclose. So we get that out of the way. Here's a little bit of what we're going to learn about tonight. It's kind of, when you go back to elementary school and you learn, that first sentence in your paragraph, you write, you just tell us what we're talking about. That first paragraph is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at identifying both verbal and nonverbal de-escalation techniques, and really understanding how verbal and nonverbal behaviors, communication, really impact both us and how we respond to behaviors, and as well as how others respond to us when we're trying to de-escalate situations. We're going to talk about effective communication, and again, we're going to look at the difference between verbal communication, nonverbal communication, how we could use each other within schools and other supports to manage different behaviors. And we're really going to talk about a plan. And when we talk about a plan for de-escalation, It's what we automatically think of as a plan of, okay, how am I going to handle this difficult situation? How am I going to handle a specific situation? But the plan also that we're going to talk about that may be a little bit different than what we ordinarily see when we talk about a plan is, how do we address our own thoughts and feelings? How do we plan in advance to address how we respond to things we see or things that we're exposed to? And then we're going to get into analyzing what we're calling this no-hit zone, which is an initiative. It's a pediatric violence initiative that has actually been uh, implemented throughout the country in different types of agencies, in mental health settings, in medical facilities, in schools, in religious organizations and buildings, and talk about how that could be implemented in a school setting as a strategy to promote safe and violent-free environments in a sense of de-escalation, so we don't get to kids physically acting out or becoming aggressive, or even adults in the school setting. One of the things that we are going to look at as a no-hit zone is we've implemented this no-hit zone here within Hackensack Meridian Health, well, within the pediatric departments. And it's not just about responding to children acting aggressively, but it's also how do we respond to adults in their aggression? How do we respond to adults so that they could address pediatric issues as well? And again, we're seeing it's that multi-layered approach to different situations. So where did we get started in this no-hit zone approach? Where did we come from in understanding the way we're going to be talking about de-escalating situations and this multi-layered approach? Because initially when we talked about looking at violence, when we looked about de-escalation, we got into our behaviors of what we can do about it. So, talk appropriately, address the solution, address the problem directly, and so forth. That was the initial way. We would just look at the behavior and we would look at the response. But we're starting to understand that aggression and violence is deeper than that. So when kids respond aggressively, whether it's verbally or physically, we have to understand that there's a layer to this. The zeitgeist within our communities sometimes is needed to understand how we support or how do we respond to physical aggression. So the no-hit zone actually started back in 2005 in Cincinnati Baby and Children's Hospital. A physician was recognizing, as we often see in medical centers, folks were starting to respond physically or aggressively too often to stuff that was going on. And we could understand that. In medical centers, there's significant stressors that go on. There's significant implications to what happens. And so they're high stress environments. And she was trying to understand, what do we do to reduce that? And one of the things that we started to understand is that we need, as professionals, as agencies, we need to, the first step is to say, we're not going to allow physical response to our emotions. So as we see in the sign behind me, and we're going to get into a little bit more in depth, is we're going to take a stand and say, as an organization, we're going to model that we're not going to allow physical response by adults or children to our emotions. So she made these signs and they put them up, and they created policy within the hospital that all team members would address escalating emotions, escalating concerns beforehand, and respond in a specific way to aggression. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how then we take that model that we've employed here at our medical facilities and use that in our communities, and how do we validate everyone's experience, kids' experience, caregivers' experience, nurses, teachers, all of our experiences, and how do we support each other in addressing these concerns. And the reason that it came to that multi-level look is because back in 2007, there was a movement, there was a change in our understanding about where aggression comes from. And a lot of the understanding came from that it's social norms that lay the foundation to how we respond to our emotions, and particularly into aggression. And where that particularly lied was in physical discipline. So CP, you see on the screen, is corporal punishment. And what we started to see in the research that corporal punishment or physically responding to our thoughts and feelings in parenting results in harm to a child. And of course, we say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. There's to some of us, it may make sense. There could be social, there could be emotional, there could be all different types of things. But what we started to recognize too in this research is that it modeled inappropriate response to our feelings, meaning as caregivers, when we use physical discipline, we're modeling aggression, and typically we're modeling it when our kids are aggressive. And remember, physical aggression, physical discipline, sorry, not physical, I mean physical aggression, physical discipline is physical aggression, but physical discipline is legal here in New Jersey. So, never do I say is like, you can't use physical discipline. Am I going to say is I don't support the use of physical discipline for the reasons we're going to talk about? Absolutely. The use of physical discipline, it doesn't make sense to me because behaviorally, it doesn't do what we hope to achieve. It has a social, emotional impact. And then we're going to see, in the next, what we're going to talk about has actually a negative impact on brain development. But one of the things that I just ask us to pause and think about real quick is that idea of physical discipline being legal in the state of New Jersey and many states too. It's not just New Jersey. And the reason I ask you to pause and think about this a little bit is the concept of this as adults. If I was walking down the street with a buddy, a coworker of mine, similar age, similar height, similar weight, and so forth, and I didn't like what they were doing, I cannot turn around and give them a whack and hit them without getting in trouble. That's illegal. I can't use physical aggression against another adult if I would like to change their behavior. Yet, we're going to say it's okay, it's legal to hit a child who is smaller in size, is a weaker in power to us as adults, if we want to use the euphemism that I hit them to manage their behavior. Now, I built in a second concept, and this is going to be important when we talk about de-escalation, is the reason that oftentimes even folks who believe in physical discipline for cultural reasons, religious reasons, historical reasons, typically use physical discipline or corporal punishment when they're angry, when they're scared, when they're not at their best emotionally. It's rare that you ever see a caregiver, and not obviously it's not legal in schools, but at home, where they're in a good mood, they're at a social gathering, they see their kids having problems, and they say, "Okay, come on over, Sally, come over, Johnny, we're going to give you a little pat, and off you go." No, we're scared, we're angry, we're frustrated, we're tired, we're hungry. It's typically the emotional response to what we see is what gets us in trouble, and it becomes we become ineffective in de-escalating in that situation, a situation at home. And it's something we have to think about too in our schools, our public settings, and so forth. But we'll get into that a little bit more with providing examples. But what I was talking about before, not only socially, emotionally, that kids are impacted by physical discipline, but also what we see in 2009, there was this small university up in Boston, you may have heard of it, Harvard, and they did two studies, and they looked at how physical discipline, not physical abuse, so none of the children that they worked with, the families they worked with, the discipline rose to the level of abuse, but they're just talking about physical discipline. They found that physical discipline results in reduction of gray matter in the brain. So it shrunk the children's brain and negatively impacted neural development. The ironic part, and this is the reason I bring it in tonight, because although we're not talking about physical discipline, we're talking about aggression and how it impacts how kids respond in schools. Physical discipline, so we already talked about, it models negative response to our emotions. It has a social impact and emotional impact. Now we're talking about a physical impact. The two areas in the brain that are most notably impacted in the reduction in gray matter and neural development is the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Those of you obviously who have a medical background understand there's impact on the frontal lobe in aggression, how we respond to our emotions. We often see in either soldiers who come back from war or folks who have frontal lobe injury to accidents are more aggressive. So it's ironic that The area that's impacted by physical discipline is then could enhance aggression because we're reducing that area. And then the neural development in the parietal lobe is associated with cognitive appraisal and understanding. So we're reducing the likelihood or the ability for the child to cognitively appraise what we're doing. So again, it talks about physical discipline having a negative impact on multi-layers. It got so, the concern became so great through the research. Finally, in 2018, the American Academy of Pediatrics altered their policy on physical discipline, where they previously had recommended using not using physical discipline, that now they've taken a stance against using physical discipline, which is significant for multiple reasons that we're not going to get into tonight. But it really speaks to that if the American Academy of Pediatrics is saying, we really shouldn't be using physical discipline. We need to look at how we're addressing concerns as a society. So there became obviously this national initiative. It really started in 2007 to end corporal punishment. And what the goal became is influencing systemic change, societal change, so that we could promote non-physical response to our emotions, whether it's as caregivers, whether it's as educators. And we need to really change our attitude about responding physically to our emotions. And that's what the no-hit zone really is about. It's not just responding when aggression occurs, because at that point it's emotional dysregulation has gotten to that point, how we are de-escalating situations. But it's what do we do in advance to create an environment or set up an environment that we're less likely going to see an escalation of emotional difficulties, that cause us to have to de-escalate, even though we will learn how to de-escalate situations. And at its core, at its primary, what we really want to look at is how, as a society, do we say, we're not going to accept an adult hitting another adult. We're not going to accept an adult hitting a child hitting another child, nor a child hitting an adult. And so part of it is establishing that as an expectation. And that's the first part of the no-hit zone, where we put up this signage. And Hackensack, like I said, Hackensack Meridian, this is a pediatric pillar initiative. So within the the three large children's hospitals in the network, so at Jersey Shore, JFK, in Edison, and here up in Hackensack, where my office is, we have these signage up, and we are serving as a model to communities. And I'll get into more of how we model to our communities and really move into schools as partners and homes as well. So what is, in a sense, is a no-hit zone? It's commitment by an organization and its team members. So we all as team members commit to certain things here in Hackensack Meridian Health. And some of you just say, this is obvious, and it is. But until we really put it out there, it may be obvious, but it doesn't rise to the level of priority. So here we have the signage. So the expectation is those four major premises are going to be established, and we as team members are going to do something about it. We serve as a model for different community members, but also agencies. And we've partnered with Head Start, Early Head Start, YMCAs, public schools, private, and we're looking to continue that partnership to facilitate no-hit zones, to de-escalate situations or prevent situations from getting to the point where they need to be de-escalated. And then, of course, the key to the longevity and this program really working is providing what we call positive or productive parent coaching. And that's a coaching model that we'll talk about more in depth at the end, but that's where we provide resources for caregivers within the community, both online or in person, where we validate emotional experiences. We provide an opportunity for folks in a 6-session model. So the model is, the parent coaching is 6 sessions, an hour each week, different times. They're online. We have 8 o'clock at night. We have 6:30 at night. We have English speaking, Spanish speaking. But in some of our community partners, we do these groups in person as well. But the premise is really facilitating positive communication between children and caregivers, validating caregivers' emotions, thoughts, and feelings, and coming up with strategies to parallel what parents can do in the groups, but also do with their kids at home, so that hopefully when they get to schools, you're seeing less aggression response to the emotions, and there's more consistency if there's a no-hit zone in school, in the understanding of that expectation, as well as within the homes and communities. A lot of this we've already discussed in itself. Is why a no-hit zone? Because typically when anybody, whether it's a child, caregiver, educator, are experiencing stress, anxiety, uncertainty, confusion, their frustration tolerance is going to be lower. They're more likely to act out in a way that they don't want to in response to a situation. So they may raise their voice, they may hit a child, or a child will hit another child. So it's not just about the adult, or a child may hit an adult. And so we need to validate experiences, identify ways to manage our thoughts and our emotions, and come up with supportive needs as a community with each other at different levels. So how do we implement the no-hit zone? There are real 4 strategies, and I'll break down each one of these. Provide information, promote safe places, build skills, and then policy reform. Now, I'm going to introduce these in this order: provide information, promote safe, and so forth and so on. However, they're integrated within each other, but we're going to explain it. And what I mean by that is, we're providing information while promoting safe places, while building skills and policy reform all at the same time. The first strategy in providing information is that basic concept of establishing an environment from the jump, from the get-go, that no form of physical response to our emotions is acceptable. That in itself has been shown through research to reduce the level of aggression or physical response, and even aggressive emotional response in those environments where this signage is put in place. But the other part of it is agreeing by all individuals in these environments. So it's in a school, educators, administration, nurses, and the students and the caregivers who enter that building all agree to this zone of respect. This is how we're going to implement the zone of respect. And if we see something escalating, we're going to say something. We're going to do it. That leads into how do we promote safe places? So we create in a network, a district, a school, an adoption and the recognition that we need to do something about it, and a commitment to doing something. Not just saying, okay, we'll de-escalate, we'll try to, but a commitment to using non-physical means of responding to our emotions, physical or verbal, doing something about it in advance, and creating a policy that we all agree to, that we're not going to respond in a certain way. So we ask ourselves, and if we were in person, I could ask these questions, but since we're not, what could be done? Think in your environment. What can be done in your physical environment to prevent high-risk behaviors? What promotes positive behaviors? We're going to answer these. Now, on the top, we're thinking, what physically? Well, what can a kid throw? Because that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about in our physical environment is how do we create an environment, whether it's the signage, the policies, to promote or prevent high-risk behaviors and promote positive. So we're looking to do 2 things: prevent or reduce negative behaviors, high-risk behaviors, and promote positive behaviors. So de-escalation is really only one aspect. It's preventing or taking down negative behaviors. We want to create an environment where de-escalation is preventing high-risk behaviors, addressing the behaviors, and enhancing positive behaviors. So let's talk about de-escalation first. The goal is, like I'm saying, is really to prevent a situation from escalating at all. So when we're creating an environment, we need to think about a couple things. We need to look at us and how we respond to things. We have to be aware of individuals that are typically in our environment and how they respond to different situations. We need to plan in advance. How am I going to respond first to myself when I become frustrated, when I'm tired, when I'm at the end of the day, or it's near lunch and I'm hungry? How am I going to address me first so that I could be a force in de-escalating something before it becomes aggressive. Then we have to identify externally. It's, we always say is, you get on the airplane, and the mask falls down. You got to put it on yourself and then your kids. And by the way, recently Julianne and I were on we were out in Salt Lake City in Utah presenting to folks, and so we got to fly out there. And I was uncertain if they weren't as clear as putting it on yourself and then others, but we're still going to hold to that. It was interesting. I noticed that on the way home. But anyway, I digress. If we were in person, I would digress a lot more. So you're lucky. Anyway, so we're going to continue. We're going to be aware of others as well. So you want to be aware of if there's children in the hallway, classrooms. Is there things that during the holiday, kids want to get out of school? Is there stuff that's going on in the environment that's increasing stress? So being aware of those things and reminding yourselves helps us to de-escalate situations before they become alarming. One of the concepts that we talk about, in schools, we have an alarm that goes off when there's smoke or fire, and it tells us, hey, something's going on and we have to address it. We need to pay attention to our thoughts, our feelings as well, that is telling us in our body, hey, something's going on and we need to address it before it becomes a fire, before there's a problem. That's the best way to de-escalate a situation, is respond and be aware before. We want to be calm, we want to be sympathetic, and we're going to talk about how we can do that both verbally, non-verbally, and paraverbally. And we'll explain what paraverbally is. And of course, I've said this before, is we want to have a plan. We want to think not only of how we're going to address the external, but how are we going to address the internal? What am I going to do to calm myself when I realize I'm getting a little bit stoked up, when my tolerance level is creeping up the scale of 1 to 10. If I'm at a 7, how am I going to bring it down? Am I impacted by hunger? Oftentimes in schools we don't have time to eat when we need to. Is there a place that I could have a snack bar or something like that? Or be aware that kids too, if it's getting towards lunchtime, it's getting towards the end of the day, there's specific times of the day where high risk, it's a higher risk to some sort of aggression. The other thing too is we want to build an education. We want to communicate with team members throughout the building, throughout the network, on how they're being impacted by what's going on, how to engage in productive intervention strategies. And then the goal is really to de-escalate, as we're saying, before and after, as early as possible. So we'll get into some of these de-escalation. So one of the things that we have to recognize is communication is multifaceted. And then we keep going into this layered approach. Communication is both verbal, it's nonverbal, and it's paraverbal. What do we mean by paraverbal? So paraverbal is everything that goes into the verbal. So it's verbal and our nonverbal. So it's our tone of voice. It's the intonation that we use. It's how we lean into our nonverbal. It's how we present. And what we see in research is that more often than not, in 90% of our interpersonal communication, as you see, is up there on the screen, is their vocal elements and nonverbal actions, which is the paraverbal. So we see that 90% of our interpersonal is impacted by the paraverbal, or those things that we don't even recognize, that we are less likely to recognize. And so in order to intervene, we have to have active reflection on ourselves and evaluation of ourselves on an ongoing basis, not just before a situation, but also after. What happened? What could I have done more effectively? And what we realize too with communication is both the message that we send out ourselves, verbally and non-verbally. So I'm not just saying verbally what I'm saying, how it's received by the other person. So how the other person receives it, hearing it, feeling it, environmentally, all of that, taking in the paraverbal, how they communicate that back to us, and how we take that in too. So you see, it's that, if you remember the game of telephone that you play, things change over that process of jumping from here to here to here and back. So we got to pay attention to all of these things in order to be effective. What you see in front of us is what some people will call attunement or awareness to what's going on, but it really talks to that paraverbal or that nonverbal. You see how much of this And our communication is the nonverbal. So our tone of voice, our volume, our pitch, the speed, the rate which we're talking, our body posture, our facial expressions. There are research that looks at kids respond significantly different to facial expressions, and kids respond more receptively to benign facial expressions versus more aggressive or perceived aggressive facial faces as well. And you have to be, sometimes folks don't recognize that their physical presentation is being perceived in a certain way. Give you an example. Once there was an interaction I had with somebody, we were going back and forth, it wasn't contentious, but I took a deep breath and I went, and I tried to think about it. That person took a very defensive response, feeling that I was gritting my teeth, and that was an aggressive response. And for me, it wasn't. I was taking a deep breath in, pursing my lips to try to think, to try to take it down a notch. But they felt it as pushing it against and pushing aggressively. It's something that we have to reflect on and understand that these are all part of our communication. And when we're going to de-escalate a situation, we want to make sure that we're not inadvertently escalating a situation. And then again, we want to practice our skills, practice for ourselves. How do we bring ourselves down? And so if you notice that these de-escalation often, and we're going to get momentarily into how to bring the other person down, and oftentimes, it's external. But most importantly, one of the things that we miss in de-escalating is how do we do it ourselves? How do we recognize ourselves, bring ourselves down, and be aware of it, and continue that process before a situation and after a situation, and even reaching out to coworkers who may be present to help them identify, how did you see me in that? Help me with this. What are my strengths? What are my weaknesses? And how do we move forward from there? Here's some ways to what we would call lead in, or say things that we validate others' experiences in a less confrontational way, but address it. So here, can I help you with something? Or most preschoolers find it hard to sit for long periods of time. Would it help if I found something for them to play with? I'll read one more. You've been waiting for a while. Could I bring you both a drink of water? Here's where the lead into it is. If you notice in each one of these examples, it's how can I help? It's not pointing out that someone did something, inappropriate, that somebody is doing something bad. It's how can I do something? It's what more can I do? And it's extremely helpful to lean into what more can I do will help de-escalate situations more than here's what you're doing that needs to correct. Here's what you're doing that's wrong. The first step, now eventually you're going to get into that, particularly with kids, but you want to model first is what else can I do? So that's the first step, is leading in and being supportive. If you've been waiting a while, or validating experience. I know you're frustrated. I know others have gotten a turn. What else can I do to help with this situation? By simply validating and leading in by saying, taking it on yourself as what else can I do, in a sense, and you can rephrase that however you want. We're going to de-escalate the emotions. We're going to partner with the person rather than conflict with the person. And that's really what we want to do, is we don't want to get into a tug of war. It really doesn't help. The helpful part, if you do think of being winning a tug of war, is leaning in a little bit before we pull. But we really want to make sure we lean in or lead in order to get cooperation. So what we're going to talk about now is effective intervention. And then we're going to talk about some ineffective intervention. Obviously, we want to respect personal space. A lot of this is intuitive, but it's something that we have to remind ourselves and put into our plan and think in advance. As much as possible, we want to remain calm. We want to be early and being aware of the signs of ourselves and others. Non-judgmental and validating is really important. So in our no-hit groups that we'll talk about briefly at the end, is the big part of what we're doing is a non-judgmental. It's human nature to judge, but what we do with our judgment is what's important. We have to validate that there are reasons that children, other adults, act out when they do. And we have to be aware of those and allow a place for that, as long as we're keeping ourselves and them, those others, safe as well. Want to be aware of what's developmentally appropriate. Here's the reason for that. That helps us manage it. So, if a child who's very young is being asked to sit somewhere for a long period of time, we have to recognize when we're going to de-escalate whatever behavior they're engaging in, that developmentally that's a challenge. So then developmentally, how am I going to address that to ensure that I'm being appropriate? And then, of course, we want to provide choices. So when we lead in, we want to provide different choices. And a lot of those choices are going to be set up by the environment, whether it's policy, rules, procedures, which you want to do in advance. So that's where there's the no-hit zone limits, or in school settings where there's established rules. And so we want to provide choices that are in line with those rules. And of course, this is the most important part of de-escalation, because we want to look at de-escalation for the long term, not just in that experience, is modeling productive behavior, how we would like for the children with whom we interact, the adults with whom we interact, to interact with us moving forward. Now, we've gone over effective. We certainly have to go over ineffective. Sometimes this is even easier to pick out. Is obviously confrontational language is not what we're going to be doing. You don't want to say, even in a benign, yeah, don't you see that this is a no-hit zone? Don't you see those signs? You can't do what you're doing. It's going to create a defensiveness. Even to feel into how you feel when I'm saying those. You get a bit of a pushback. You get a personal, and that goes into that too. We want to make sure that we're still respecting others' personal space. How would you feel if somebody got into your personal? It's a reactive, it's a neurological response when somebody gets into your personal space, which is about arm's length, that you're going to get defensive. It's a protective response. We have to be mindful of that. However, we also don't want to get into a de-escalation situation where our personal safety is at peril. The first thing is your personal safety. So if you don't believe that you could de-escalate a situation while remaining personally safe, don't do it. If it's a personally unsafe environment, step back and do what you need to protect yourself first, because you're not going to be productive if you and others are going to be personally harmed, physically or emotionally. Try not to get into those traps, particularly with kids, where you get into that power struggle. Middle school, high school, you don't want to get to it. Even if you feel you're right, is lean into it. I hear where you're going. I'm validating you. What else can I do? You could always engage in corrective behaviors after the emotions are calm. After don't overreact. Sometimes kids have a point. Sometimes adults have a reason for it. We had an interaction here where some of the team members here today were getting really riled up. And I found myself emotionally escalating. Not that I acted, thankfully, but then I said, you know what? There's some validity to what folks are saying. That let me allow a place for their feelings. Let me allow a place for my frustration, and then help me bring it down so that I could not act defensively and I could be appropriate. And of course, condescending or sarcasm has its place in certain situations, but not in de-escalating situations. Finally, we get into building skills with parents and caregivers, and this gets into our groups. And this is where it's really important that it's multi-layered, and we provide an opportunity for caregivers to learn what we're doing in schools of managing our thoughts and feelings, de-escalating situations before they occur, planning in advance, understanding developmentally and developmentally appropriate and inappropriate behaviors, and coming up with ways to support each other as a community. And that really gets into what we do in our positive and productive parenting groups, which I'll get into just shortly. But again, this is the last strategy, is implementing a no-hit zone really gets into establishing a policy, establishing procedures that we know how to address situations, how to support kids, how to support others. And it's really about modeling. So if we look at our no-hit zone policy here within Hackensack Meridian Health, it's a simple policy: no hitting or escalating a verbal aggression. If it's observed, it's everyone's responsibility to intervene and communicate. We had a policy before that we can't obviously act aggressively, but this is about reacting and responding to things we see. When we see it, Here in the hospital, we also, will approach and say, hey, I know you've been waiting long. I see that things are going difficult. Here's some information for you. Here's there's a fidget toy in here. There's a pencil kit. There's crayons. There's coloring books that helps distract kids, bring things down. But it's the same thing that can happen in schools. You could identify something to de-escalate the situation so you could address it. You're going to educate staff about how we're going to address de-escalation, how we're going to address problems, and we're also going to provide a resource to our caregivers in providing a opportunity to participate in our parenting group. So your role is obviously supportive communication, effective interventions, and I'm summarizing, promote a safe and healthy environment. Here's the key concepts of our no-hit zone message. And before we get into the questions, you see is a lot of this is just summarizing what we're talking about. This is obviously healthy. We want to encourage healthy, nurturing relationships between caregivers, between professionals, colleagues, coworkers. We want to prevent and create supportive environments so that we don't have a escalation, and obviously we want to have nonviolent conflict resolution skills. And this to me, and I think that Juliana and I have talked about this a lot, who's our coordinator, is really the core of how we're going to be successful in creating environments in public that are nonviolent and so forth. And that is these coaching groups. And what these coaching groups are, as I said, there's 6 sessions, and each one of the sessions has a different focus to it. But it moves from the initial sessions of validating the difficulties of caregiving, validating, and when I say caregiving, it's whether you're a caregiver in the schools, whether you're a caregiver in home, whether you're an aunt, uncle, coach, whoever it is, if you're involved in caring for children for a level, there's a stress to it. There's cultural aspects to it. There's religious aspects to it. There's family history aspects to it. So we have to allow a place for that and validate those type of things. Then as we move through the different groups, we talk about how do we identify some of what we were talking about earlier about this verbal communication, nonverbal communication, our own emotional regulation, how we're impacted, our own triggers to that. How do we manage all of that? And how do we do this in a manner that we're modeling this to our children? And then how do we have a plan within our homes, within our schools, within our agencies and institutes of how to address difficulties when they arise, and how are we going to address them when they don't go as planned? We build that as a family to model because what we want to do in public as well, because where we're able to reduce aggression in homes, we're going to reduce aggression in public, and we're going to reduce aggression and violence in general. We're going to reduce the amount of physical abuse, sexual abuse, because where we see there's increase of aggression in homes, there's increase in all other types of aggression and all other types of abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, school avoidance, and all of the problems that we're seeing throughout our community. And the idea is that we model in the schools the non-tolerance of physical and aggressive, verbally aggressive responses. We learn how to model for kids, and then we provide these coaching groups as well. As you see here is those QR codes can be used. Anybody is invited to participate in these groups. They rotate. So we start with group 1 and goes through 6. You could sign up for it. We have signups throughout into the new year. Right now, the virtual groups are from 8 to 9, so they don't interfere with caregiving responsibilities, getting kids to sleep and so forth. We found caregivers have given us feedback, although it's late, it allows them to fully participate. We have them in English and in Spanish, as you see. Tuesdays and Thursdays are our English groups. Wednesdays, we have our Spanish groups, and we're partnering with outside agencies like school districts, Head Start, early Head Starts, and YMCAs to do a train the trainer model. So if you have staff within the schools that you think would be great coaches to be part of coaching these groups, and the reason we are coaches is because coaching is part of a team. We're not above the team. We're part of the team, and we're learning through our experiences and others, and we're working on this together. But we have a coaching, train the trainer model, so that if your agency, your school district, your school is interested in having a no-hit zone, we certainly, Juliana and myself will come in and talk about how that could work both in the school as well as providing the positive and productive parenting. And we're also working with the NJ4S to assist and provide services there. And I highly recommend using it. It's a relatively new spoken hub model where you could reach out and they could provide services for students, parents, as well as folks within the school. And we're part of that. So I encourage that as that multi-layered approach to what we have. So here you have our evaluation screen. So I guess you could use your little QR code to do an evaluation. And then, as I promised Allison and Juliana, I would give 10 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. So as promised, at 6:50, I will open it up to questions and comments. This is Juliana and my contact information. Feel free to email us as well too if you don't want to ask questions now, or if you're interested in us bringing in a no-hit zone. By the way, one last thing that I forgot to say before I take questions. No-hit zones are free. So we will come in and provide you with materials that are necessary, information, whether it's pamphlets for caregivers, whether it's if you'd like us to speak to team members within the team, whether it's learning how to come up with a no-hit zone policy, how to move forward with a no-hit zone. All of this is free of charge. It's provided by Hackensack Meridian Health, because we know that resources are difficult everywhere. So if we're going to do something to reduce violence, reduce aggression, and keep kids safe, we need to help out and do what we can. So that is a big plug for our program, and we're here to help you in any way that we can in creating a healthy and safe environment in your schools.
Thank you so much, Dr. Biller. That was very informative. I just have to go back. There was a question submitted in regards to the study. I just have to find it again. So it's a reference to the study. Has this study been replicated? While I'm not an advocate of CP, it keeps moving.
Yeah, because as people put in questions, it's going to bump up. So
yeah. Let me try. I'm sorry. Let me find it again. Okay. What?
Oh, sorry. Let me put the QR code back up.
Okay. It is one study with 147 children. Is that sufficient for making policy?
So what we put up, just, is some examples of different, one is, I'm not sure which study, because there's a couple studies that we put up there, but anytime I use studies in slides, I'm not going based off of one study. We're using examples of many different studies. And there's been meta-analysis or meta-research, which looks at different studies altogether that have come to the findings that physical discipline is both negative for, as we talked about, emotionally, socially, as well as in the gray matter in the brain. Just so you know, too, is Harvard studies are one of the most, they have, and I was just talking to someone about this, one of the most stringent criteria for publishing studies because of the weight that it carries in publishing from Harvard. So any of those studies that come out, we could have pretty strong power. And even so, if you look at research and doing research, an N or a number, N in research is the number of participants of 147, has pretty strong statistical significance to that. But if you want other research, reach out to us, and I could provide you other research, other articles, and can have further discussions about it.
Perfect. And there's a lot of questions around the survey. We will, after the program, send out a link for the survey as well. So If you don't get it here, we will send it out.
And Allison, we can also share the PowerPoint presentation included with the evaluation. And if there's any other questions, we can go into some of the questions that we had at the registration.
Yes. All right. So the first one, are there root causes? And if there are, how do we stop them from happening?
Yeah. I love that question. So I'm presuming when we say, are there root causes, we're talking about, are there root causes to aggression in kids and their inability to manage emotions? And there are many root causes. And it's something that we all have to be mindful of, because there's organic causes and then there's environmental causes. So there can be, aggression is because kids are coming from a deprived environment. And I don't just mean, means of physical means of food and so forth, although that has a significant impact. But I'm talking a deprived emotional environment where aggression is modeled in a response to responding to difficulties or frustration. Their kids are more likely going to respond in that way as well. If there's a home or an environment where kids haven't learned to emotionally regulate, they're going to be more aggressive. And truthfully, we could relate to kids in the same way that we look at ourselves. How many times have we, acted with our partners or in school or in work? We've acted in a way that, looking back, we certainly didn't like, and we realize it's because we're hungry or tired. We've all heard the expression of being, hangry. So it's things. There are so many different reasons that kids act out. And that's what I said, is if we could look at things in advance, if we recognize that, things typically get escalated before lunch or at the end of the day, or a certain child, doesn't have the same resources and they're responding. These are certain ways that we could look at responding. But there are so many different things that cause aggression. But one of the biggest things that we can do is validate their experience, go with them instead of pushing against. So it's with rather than against, and really understand how we respond as well, so we don't get into that conflict and further escalate it. But there's so many, whether it's the basic ones of being tired, hungry, or deprived environment, or being modeled to them in the home or by others. And that's why the general concept of the no-hit zone is to model non-physical, non-aggressive means for our emotions, so that could be modeled for kids to better understand, hopefully in homes and in public.
Thank you. The next question, can you give tips for early identification of escalating behaviors?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it's interesting because everybody's a little bit different, but our faces are really good indicators. But I also say we have to look at the environment, being cautious and understanding of times that are more, kids are more prone to. Now, we're never going to be 100% able to predict things, but like we said, is if there's things going on in the community, if things are escalating just relatively, whether it's in the news, whatever it may be, we have to be more aware when the environment is more prone to it. It's kind of like when you're working with electric, they want to make sure there's no fumes in the air, because when there's a spark, it could set it off. So there's certain environments that we want to be aware of that could escalate things, and then certainly paying attention to the physical aspect, because that is part of communication. And typically, before a child loses their cool, becomes aggressive, you'll see it escalating, whether it's changing in the color of their face, they're squinting their eyes, the hands will clenching it. So paying attention to those things and addressing it prior to it escalating, allowing the place and saying, hey, Johnny, hey, Sally, I see things are getting frustrated. I think things are getting, what can I do to help? What more can I do? And lean into it when you see those things.
Thank you. The next question is requesting a student be evaluated for a crisis beneficial if they aren't seen when the episode is occurring? And can some of these strategies be used for adults?
Yeah. So as you've heard today, I'll go backwards. Every one of the strategies is helpful for adults. And the idea of what we're doing is modeling for ourselves what is most effective in our kids. So in our parent coaching groups, we're learning techniques to identify our own emotions that we could then work with our children, identifying our triggers so that we could teach our kids how to identify our triggers. How do we communicate? Being aware of communication so we could do that with our kids. And then when we set up expectations in the schools or in our homes, we want to set up the same expectations for adults that we're establishing for kids as well. I don't know why that light went off, so I apologize. But anyway, the other thing about the evaluation is, yeah, absolutely. It's rare that we're going to be able to, immediately have a child evaluated after the situation. But because we're not seeing something any longer doesn't mean that there's not a risk there. We often talk about when looking at an imminent risk when something is related to emotional is we may not see the manifestation behaviorally of the concern until later on, or if it's too late. And there's a similar aspect. I use the analogy of smoking is people who smoke say, oh, I'm healthy, I'm fine, I could run a marathon, whatever. And that may be true right now, but it doesn't mean that there's not harm that's being done that we're going to see manifested later, that an evaluation would certainly be helpful to speak to that, and really get at how do we help this child as a team rather than waiting for a response to happen. How do we support them in advance?
All right, thank you. So a question just came in, and this will probably be the last question. As a nurse working with nonverbal children, do you have recommendations for evidence-based techniques to help de-escalate challenging behaviors during moments of frustration?
Yeah, so it's really tough with nonverbal children. And then the other thing too is one of the things you really need to check with are the school and the policies and procedures of schools and so forth, because a lot of times with nonverbal, some of the evidence-based techniques involve touching, and that you have to make sure that's okay with policy. But nonverbal children are more prone, to get frustrated. So you have to allow them a place to express themselves. And like we said, is verbally is not always not possible, but is not always the means for any of us of expressing it. Holds are legal, but that's at the last resort. The difficult part with nonverbal is a lot of the evidence-based procedures are involving touch. But if you want, shoot me an email and I'll send you some information about it so you can check with your district or your school what is permissible, not permissible.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Biller. We've gotten a lot of comments, great information. Thanks for providing an evening presentation. So just want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us tonight. Please make sure that you complete your survey so you can obtain your contact hours. And also there's a question on there about what other topics you would be interested in. So please make sure to fill that out. So we plan to have additional school nurse forums in 2026 that we hope you'll join us for. We will email you about those opportunities, or please check our website to find out more information about those upcoming programs and others. And I also included in the chat our program booklet of resources and programs that we can offer your schools. So please feel free. Hope you had the chance to download it. If not, we can send that out in an email as well. But thank you again, Dr. Biller. Thank you, Juliana. And thank you all for joining us. And I hope you all have a great night.
Great.
Thank
you.
you.